Okay, so part two of this week's stuff, we're going to move more specifically to talk about gender and managing violence in the hospitality space. So, yeah, so tell us a little bit about the kind of where this came from in the project.
Okay, so the last section we were talking about was, about, I guess, gender, sexuality, how women and broader feminine subjectivities make them good workers. As part of those conversations, we found the bar workers would also talk about, as part of, in part of the same process, that they would have to manage harassment just as part of the job, as part of being a young woman in the world and at work. They would also talk about how they were also positioned by their colleagues and just by the venues as being more able to deal with problematic customers. And that would often mean they would be asked to, or not even asked to, it would just be sort of the logical thing for them to do, to be the ones to be sent to deal with aggressive or problematic customers, and they would often eject them from the venues. And this is where no security staff were employed in some of these
particularly those kind of smaller venues.
Yeah, where no security staff existed in these venues, women were positioned and felt like they were able to, be the ones to deal with and manage violence. So they were sort of managing, I guess, all of these gendered kind of contexts of behaviours, from harassment to physical abuse to all kinds of physical
stopping fights.
Significant, putting themselves, you'll see in some of the examples, putting themselves between customers. And we were sort of, took us a long time to think this one through, because we initially thought, women, maybe it's a positive thing that women are being positioned in this way because they can sort of strategically deploy femininity. It's how we were initially discussing it, but we sort of, much more took in the gendered politics angle, I think, to see, like, what does it mean then if women are, again, I guess, paradoxically put in that place of being expected to bring all of these feminine attributes or femininity kind of capacities to work, already tolerating with and managing so much harassment as part of the job, which they can essentially really do nothing about, and then also being placed in the most actual physical risk situations, to be responsible for kicking out the same guys who'd been grabbing them, a couple of minutes earlier. I mean, that was just sort of the ultimate, I guess, backwards, upside down kind of gendered situation. But somehow the gendered relations made it all make sense in terms of, women are more able to calm men down, and it's just really just the gendered problems that are operating here, rather than being some kind of empowerment situation.
Yeah, it's kind of takes the concept of emotional labour to another level, doesn't it? Like, it's not just placating feelings in this situation. It's like literally physically dealing with men that are being violent.
It's really extreme, and this is something that we had not found documented anywhere. I mean, lots of studies of the nighttime economy talk about how it's like, this volatile masculine environment. There were all the one punch laws that were, in New South Wales over the past decade. That kind of broader, it's known that, the risk of violence and assault is in these spaces. So it seemed just so bewildering, really, to us.
But it was also really common. Like, it wasn't just like at a couple of venues. Like, most people we spoke to, and we kind of, after we discovered this thing and then started asking about it in later interviews, it's like, of course, this is happening. And the men would talk about doing it as well. Exactly. Like, not doing it by like sending women over to, or expecting women to look after these things. So this one's about attempting to mitigate different threats of harm and violence, and Jenny and Felicity. So they talk about, these ones are kind of expressing the actual physical nature of what's going on here. Being spat at, coming back, this person here kicked someone out and then literally came back to their venue and like followed them home and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, I guess, showing that there is certainly an actual risk of harm that goes on here. And they would often talk about sort of it being, most men, you can de-escalate and kick out, and because they don't want to be seen as the one who will, punch a woman in public, because most men won't. But the most did so much kind of heavy lifting. It was
this expectation seems to make sense until the moment it doesn't.
Yeah, exactly.
And the thing with the violence too is like, the idea that men won't hit a woman, like we know the ridiculous rates of domestic violence, like men do hit women all the time.
Exactly.
That the way that it kind of relies on that kind of hegemonic masculine idea that you wouldn't do it in public, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Because a man wouldn't hit a woman, right? So there's all this kind of gendered stereotypes enrolled in these relations that do make sense on a kind of broader theoretical analytical level, but like in the moment, they only kind of matter until someone gets hit.
Exactly. There's so many qualifications going on here. It's like, oh, it works in these situations unless it's just
and this also really clearly shows like can't just leave this stuff at work.
No,
you can't just, you don't walk out of the venue and all of a sudden the dickhead just disappears. That's still there, and you need to then to take that risk home with you.
Yeah, exactly. The facade kind of crumbles in this example, I think.
So they talk about managing a bit of argy-bargy and stuff like that.
So I mean, one of the main ways they said that women were better suited, which was a quote, to deal with aggressive men would be because the masculine aspects of sociality were sort of, again, a gendered norm that is just doing so much heavy lifting in the working practices of these people. So saying that male bar members are really not able to well de-escalate situations, even if they go in really calmly with all these kind of calm relationality things. It would just amp up the aggressor. So women were seen as positioned outside of those masculine sociality relations because they were women. So they, bring all those coded, behaviors and expectations with them. So
I'm not your mate. So the stand is talking about if I go over and do this, try to get involved, the guy will lark up because I'm another dude, and therefore I'm now a kind of threat to his masculinity, and therefore the violence kind of escalates because of that. If you're trying to be nice, the aggressive guy is going to say something like, "I'm not your mate." Caution, all that kind of thing.
Exactly. But we so often would see these interesting lines. Like we had quite a few examples like this about telling us how it would be if, in the gendered situation with a man coming over, and then they're generally not open to punching females depending on the individual. No, there would always be a little at the end that I'd always be like, oh, but But then what does happen when that person is the one? And that, they existed.
That's right. They often had stories about them.
Exactly.
So managing men again. So Jenny here talks about some direct strategies.
So the kind of element of surprise is something Jenny talked about a lot. Because again of the gendered aspects, they're not expecting a small woman to be in there because they're not expecting a woman to enter into this very kind of masculine aggression sociality dynamic. So she'd say they would be surprised and hopefully rethink. It'd just kind of be like a circuit breaker is how she described it. She said, but then there's so many assumptions built into that. She said she's assuming they don't want to hit her, and they're assuming that they don't want her to get hurt, because then it's expected to flip into this kind of protective, like I want to protect a vulnerable woman kind of other aspect of the gendered norms going on in this. But they don't want to be the dude who hit a woman in a pub. But there are very few dudes that do not care about that. But this,
again, at the end of the quote.
Again, at the end of the quote.
So talk here about like sensing risk. This kind of, again, we've kind of mentioned it before, this embodied kind of instinct, kind of being able to in the previous weeks we talked about like workers being able to spot a drunk or spot a problem, and there was particularly classed stereotypes and symbolic measures attached to that. The more gendered aspect was kind of around creeps and stuff like that. So
exactly. And this was again part of the embodied capacities that very much were part of the dimensions of femininity and gender for being a young woman in the world, as they said. They talked about one of the reasons they would often be good workers is because they did have an instinct, not just for how to make people happy and how to read people and to create a pleasurable experience in the bar, but also to be able to prevent or mitigate, intervene into problems before they even occurred. So it was almost, they described it themselves as intuition. It really was operating at a very highly tuned level. I mean, the amount of the way they were so fine-tuned to be able to look at all of the different interactions, not just between themselves and colleagues, but they'd be able to, read situations from across the room and be really looking at the micro detail at the same time as being able to, be doing all these other kind of physical tasks, pouring, talking, taking things, but just having this scanning, always checking.
So particularly we had some participants talking about how they would often be scanning the crowd to ensure that other women in the bar weren't being drunk women taken advantage of and all that kind of stuff as well. They'll kind of manage, not just managing their own individual risk, but like doing more broadly to managing kind of gendered risk and sexual harassment across the bar generally. Yeah,
exactly. So this is the quite really about having an instinct for creeps that they'd already developed. They can always just have such a highly honed capacity to be able to detect problems before they arose, or undertones.
Undertones is a really good way to put it. Subtle harassment's harder to address because they might turn around and say they were just being nice. Kind of way to kind of turn around the creepiness into this kind of just being friendly kind of stuff. It's a pretty common thing that came up throughout a lot of the interviews. Absolutely. So there's different also social contexts in terms of the way this happens. So Karen talks about this kind of moment here, tells the guy to get the fuck out of there. But he talks about how she wouldn't have done it if it was only for me.
Exactly. So often they would put themselves in harm's way, I guess, as part of the work, because they're doing it on the behalf of other patrons, and often they'd talk about other women, even if it was a really minor, like, I was just being friendly example, like the last one, the women would often come up to them afterwards and say, thank you so much. Because that was what you thought it was, So they felt a real responsibility to, again, I guess all of this is in the context of all these additional labouring practices that are not recognised that women perform in these jobs, not because of the gender roles attached to them which require it. And just being a woman at work just brings all this in these settings, has so many laden additional meanings.
And that example too is like, it blurs that production consumption thing. Like, so there's a solidarity there between the female worker and the female consumer in terms of the risks that are going on in this space as well.
Definitely.
Okay, so do you want to kind of sum up this? So this is part 2, and we're going to talk to me. I'm going to talk to Megan in the third part to more specifically break it down and talk about aspects of sexuality. But in terms of the gendered aspects of the project that we did, and we're getting to the end of, we're writing this up at the moment. So what do you want to kind of tell us about our findings and what it can mean for the industry?
Well, just that, I guess, to summarise some of the things we have already been saying to tie it together. So the gender norms do just add on so many additional tasks and required behaviours, and down from very practical things like being able to potentially kick out someone who is going to harass and be a real problem, a real creep, but also just those finely tuned and honed skills of managing not just those aggressions, but also to create the fun kind of atmosphere. So all of these additional capacities are folded into the work for young women. And we see those aspects of being really problematic. So it's the gender norms themselves that are the real issues, because they make it possible for women to be called on to manage things in this way. And that can really hide, or I guess complicate or individualize a lot of the time these problems as just like, it's just a matter of dealing with these things. But really, if we see these as a problem of gendered inequalities, which we do, then that requires, you know, much larger conversations to be had around the kinds of behaviours that are expected or acceptable at a society-wide level that people bring into the bar.
Yeah.
You know?
One of the things I suppose that came up where women in bar work felt, when they felt supported by management and felt that their venue was backing them around these things, they felt much more safer and could do the work properly. Others spoke about when they had to deal with these problems and didn't feel they were getting supported by management and those around them, particularly you had like managers that like didn't care and just thought it was part of the job. And actually often I think in those situations, managers are happy to see the women exploited because it's attracting people coming in or whatever. That's when they felt like the job was heaps more risky and problematic. So yeah, we have things to kind of say, I suppose, about how venues themselves can structure themselves in a way that probably won't remove 100% of the risks, but will at least allow the workers to feel like they can act on them, be respected and do something about it. That at least, I suppose, minimises the risk or the feeling that they're being completely exploited and harassed in these places.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, having an overt zero tolerance policy is really important. And so that will, one of the recommendations we're, I guess, developing is that there are agreed upon behavioural expectations between staff, between management and staff, and then that's communicated to customers. And in some places you will see do have zero tolerance posters around, but I guess having that supported by broader frameworks that operate within the venue is important. So it's not just a poster. It's that there is a process, instead of it just being like, oh, we'll just strategically manage it in the most efficient way we can in this moment, which is often have a woman do it, to say, okay, what's the situation? What do we all agree that we want to happen in these situations?
Yeah, and the processes are important too, because posters are just another thing that, you know, can give the space a vibe of being a safe place. But if it's not actually something going on that makes it a safe place, it's not really.
Yeah. Exactly. It can be tokenistic, which I'm sure Megan will talk about in the next one. So
okay, thanks, Julie. I'll stop it there.
Thanks.